but again, welcome. And to begin with, as we look at water, one of the features that I'm not sure you've ever reflected upon seriously is the fact that water is critical to every element of life. There's nothing on this planet, in fact in this universe, that does not depend on water. Today we're going to direct our activities to how, in particular, water has an impact on our bodies as humans, and perhaps to begin to evaluate it as a healthy thing that is more than just some clear liquid that is convenient and you get a thirst for, but that it has some activity. And in fact, the word bioavailability, or water that's available to you as a living entity, is the approach that we're going to take today. Now, if we start off and get a sense of what are these differences in water, and what's in my water? I mean, to most of this audience, you at least have some elementary knowledge of water, but we're going to just start from the beginning and say, in many of the towns, including this one, but more appropriately across the United States, things are added to the water to attempt to clean it. And so for most of this century, what has happened is that they have begun to add chlorine to the water. Now, for many of you, you say, so what's wrong with that? In fact, I have a swimming pool, and I have chlorine in my swimming pool, and I take a shower every day. I mean, what's wrong with that? I mean, we're here in the United States, and we have excellent water. And of course the government wouldn't bother us here in terms of putting something in the water that might be injurious. I say to you that this has not been a conscious attempt to make you sick or to have an impact on yourselves. The problem we're faced with today is that the government doesn't know what else to use. So even as we back up for just a minute and look at these pristine rivers and streams that we have in this region, and in the Pacific Northwest, we get a lot of rain, so there is a lot of water around. And we look at the beautiful Pacific River, Columbia River Basin, and say, but of course we have good water here, and we have pristine rivers, and we have a beautiful mountain here that gives off a lot of water, that supplies a lot of the area. But how many of you remember about a year and a half ago, wasn't that big in the news, but there were reports about a science class. This was a group of high school kids that decided to look at the rivers and streams as part of their science project. And in the course of that, they started running across all these little frogs with deformities. They saw so many that everybody got excited about it, and it became a national issue, to the point that what they were seeing, if you can imagine, were frogs with 3 eyes and 7 legs and 2 extra organs and things missing. And you could say, so, okay, that's a frog. Wait a minute, what significance does that have to me? Number one, we found them in our little rivers and streams here in the Pacific Northwest. They also found them in the 1,000 lakes in Minnesota, which are coming off of supposedly some pretty pristine waters over the Canadian border. These were in areas where we thought at least they would have clean water. I mean, if I had to pick a state like perhaps New Jersey, where it's been noted that the water has been bad for years, or the District of Columbia, where they don't know what in the devil they're going to do with the water there, or areas which are heavily populated, you know, we would perhaps think that maybe I have a little dirty water there, but even there, people don't realize just how bad their drinking water is. When I've spoken to people from the Department of Energy, one of whom I know rather closely, and when she came to visit out here, she came with her bottle of water. And I said, well, you don't need to bring bottled water. This was a couple years ago. You don't need to bring bottled water out here. We have excellent water. She says, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. Anywhere we travel in the United States, we take our bottled water. He says, are you aware that in the state of South Carolina, right at the Georgia border, that the water almost lights up and irradiates when, if you were to put something that would allow the radiation to show? Do you realize that here in Washington State you have the largest Superfund in the United States in terms of cleaning up the water, the groundwater, as secondary to Hansford, and what took place there in the building of nuclear submarines and for a nuclear power plant? In fact, if we back up just a minute, we find that there is, since 1995, and I don't watch that much TV, but on occasion something says turn the set on, and I walked into my house one day in 1995, July of 1995, it says turn the TV on. And just at that moment, the Center for Communicable Diseases was making an announcement that I just happened to hear. It's only on for one day. So they had done their public duty to announce to the public what they wanted to say. And in that broadcast, they noted that there was no safe drinking water left in the United States. Now, people begin to say, well, I have a well, and I have excellent water because I don't have chlorine and fluorine in my water. Wrong. Most of the tributaries of the Columbia are in trouble. And if the frogs aren't news enough to you that there's a problem, I tell you, take another look. Now, when we look at those frogs, again, why are these frogs so important? If you begin to go into the coal mines around the world and they're worried about noxious gases or toxic gases being eliminated, the old rule was to send in a canary. The canary didn't come out. The canary died. You knew you didn't go in. Well, the frogs are comparable to those canaries when we speak of the water system. They're that sensitive to critical changes in the water, enough to say to you, don't go into the water or don't drink that water. Our water's bad. And not to scare you and not to send you into a depression about it, if I said to you that the United States did not have enough money to meet the needs to change the water system, the onus then comes on us in individual families to decide what am I going to do for my family? What am I going to do to make sure that my water is tolerable? When I think of little babies, and I know that these babies are totally dependent upon what I feed them and what I give them to drink for their life. And if you come from that perspective, you get a sense of the responsibility you have for your family in terms of knowing and understanding what's in your water and what you can do about it. Now, we've created a pretty grim picture here, but to say that there are things that can change your water and make it more healthy, make it so that your body can absorb it and use it and help you to become healthy, that's what we're about today. So let's take a closer look at this chlorine that we mentioned here. And many of you were around during the First World War. And do you remember the use of gas masks by the troops in Europe with the First World War? That was to prevent the chlorine gas that was used in an attempt to use biological warfare with the troops during the First World War. It was chlorine gas they used. Well, guess what, folks? That same chlorine gas is generated every time you take a shower. And in fact, you inhale more chlorine taking a shower than you do even drinking 8 glasses of it a day. Probably haven't thought about that and its impacts on your lungs. Nevertheless, getting into a swimming pool and swimming in chlorine, you absorb through your skin, the largest organ in your body, chlorine. Things you probably never even reflected on. Well, when I put that chlorine with a body, and let's take a vegetarian to begin with, and say, well, I only eat vegetables, I can't imagine anything toxic would interfere with my body. Well, when vegetables decay in the body and they mix with chlorine, they turn into another compound, and the one that they turn into is trihalomethane. Now you can say, okay, so what's trihalomethane? How many of you take your clothes to the cleaners to get them clean? Yeah, the occasion to go to the cleaners, okay? Well, the cleaning fluid that they use to clean your clothes is trihalomethane. So you can imagine that what you're introducing to your body is trihalomethane, or cleaning fluid. Terrible thought. the cancerous effects of trihalomethane have been very well documented. And you say, well, I don't understand. Why would they do this? Well, let's take another example, because you're not vegetarian. So we'll make you a meat eater. And you say, well, I don't have any problems with that. Wrong. That decaying meat stuff in your bowel, for all of you that have one bowel movement a week or one bowel movement every other day, turns into a fine paste in the digestive tract. And that paste deposits along the blood vessels and stiffens or hardens the blood vessels. So instead of being flexible pipes, we've now got these hard steel-type pipes within our system. And you wonder about where your high blood pressure came from. You wonder about hardening of the arteries and what's going on in your heart. Let's try a little chlorine in your system in terms of not being able to utilize or move out some of the things in your bowels. You know, the old middle-aged spread that guys take for granted is something that's supposed to happen. Wrong. A lot of that, the hardening that's going on there, is because of the elements that are in water itself. Then we add, what else do we have there? Well, the government has already decided that it can't use chlorine. I mean, they can't add any more chlorine to the water. They recognize that there are a lot of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that they would like to kill. But if they add more chlorine, they know that they're stepping into some very toxic levels. So what are they adding additionally to make things more, or to make them more safe so that they're not as dangerous from an infectious disease perspective? Guess what they're adding, folks? Mercury. Now, for all of you that know about the old amalgam scenario in terms of not having amalgam in your teeth and how it reacts with the body, you know the toxic nature of mercury being in the system. And guess what else? They're not required to tell you that they have mercury in the water. The laws are written so they only have to tell you about chlorine. They don't have to tell you about mercury. In Michigan, in Washington State, and Washington, D.C., mercury is added to the water systems. So you get an idea that perhaps it's not the safest thing in the world to be drinking at a time when I'm saying to you, drink more water. In fact, that's what got me into this in the first place. You know, I got across to my patients that, yes, you should drink more water. And then they turned back to me and said, okay, doc, what water are we going to drink? And I got stumped. And it really has taken me around the world to try to find some of the best waters and the best things to use in your water that will help you have safe and clean water. Now, what about the old fluoride scare? What in the dickens is going on with fluoride? There have been debates back and forth. There have been blow-ups in different legislatures as to whether or not fluoride should be used. The study that originally talked about fluoride came about during the 1930s, and it was done at the Carnegie Mellon Institute. Now, Carnegie Mellon happens to be one of the biggest benefactors of the aluminum industry, with Alcoa aluminum. The aluminum industry has a problem. They don't know what to do with the byproducts of making aluminum. And in fact, around any aluminum plant, you'll find there's no vegetation for miles. And any animals that happen to be grazing in farms or whatever near an aluminum plant, you'll find dies and ages very fast. Well, the same thing happens to you if you're exposed to fluoride. Your body will age doubly fast. So a 30-year-old will look like they're 60 years old. And in areas of the world where fluoride is naturally, these people do age very, very fast. In addition to that, going back to that study which says we should add fluoride to the water because it will prevent tooth decay in children. Wrong. When they tried to repeat that study, and that study was done by a benefactor of the aluminum industry at Carnegie Mellon, when they tried to repeat that study, they found it was not correct. And in fact, it caused further decay of the teeth. In other words, it enhanced decay of the teeth rather than preventing decays. I don't know if you're aware, but fluoride is the chemical that's used, that's injected into zoo animals and the bulls and the bullfighting rings of Spain to keep them docile. In Russia, While the Iron Curtain was still down, I don't know if they're still doing it or not, but they added fluoride to the drinking water of all the prisoners to keep them under control. I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why fluoride perhaps is being added to our drinking water, but it's there. Lead, I think many of you are familiar with the toxicity of lead. In many of the older cities, the pipes were all made out of lead. Or where the pipes are joined together, lead was used by the plumbers to keep leaks. The soldering of the pipes in the middle, lead was used. Now, lead has been known for years in terms of its toxicity to the brain. It goes directly to the brain and can be a cause for death. Now, many of these elements are very, very toxic, and the people that absorb them the most are fast-growing tissue, which would be our children. So that often we see the toxicity in the children with many of these heavy metals and the gases. So you want to be aware of that. In fact, there was just a year ago an announcement in the Seattle system of the worry about lead in its water systems. It's very high in a number of the old houses in Seattle. There are a number of old houses here in this area. So don't think you're out of it just simply because you don't live in a big city. Many of the old farmhouses still have lead as the basic pipes that they use, the old galvanized pipes, or the solder used in the pipes are made of lead. So you may want to, take note of that. Now, I thought that we'd move from there, and let me just say, we're in a world where the word filter versus purification system, as we move into this new century, are the terms that we're switching from. To the American public, first question they usually ask is, what kind of filter is this? And they've gotten pretty used to looking at carbon filters and looking at water conditioners and things being added to the water, okay? That's old technology. That's the technology of the 70s and the 80s. Yes, charcoal-type filters will take out odors, will take out smells, will take out basically gas types of materials and their smell from the water. But that's all they do. You want to know about what things will actually convert the water into a drinkable or to a live thing that you can absorb into the body. About 25 years ago, and through this community, we had people very much interested in BEV water. And what did BEV water mean? BEV stands for Bioelectric Vincent, standing for Dr. Vincent's name out of France. He decided to come up with a standard that could be used for measuring how toxic water was. And so things were divided into what we call BEV units. Yes. In that, he used distilled water as the basic water to measure all waters by. And it's simply a standard that says if I have a particular BEV number of units and that water is pure, that water is clean, it is drinkable. Reverse osmosis here, which we have on the screen, to give you an example, the things that are looked at, pH and resistance or RH factor. And again, as it is gauged against distilled water. Reverse osmosis is a good way of purifying your water. The only problem we have with reverse osmosis is that it takes everything out of the water. And what's left after reverse osmosis is what we call in the water industry dead water. It does nothing, it gives nothing back to the body. So that we've got a water that's clean, but it's just sort of sitting there, it will not interact with your cells. As you can see, this is in BEV units with reverse osmosis. The pH usually will range anywhere from 5.3 to 6.8. The RH factor is 25 to 29. We'll come back to the electrolysis portion of this, but electrolysis being a process that is used to clean up water, you can see the difference here in terms of the RH factor and the pH. It's almost 3,000-fold stronger than with a reverse osmosis unit. Now, I bring up reverse osmosis because the government is recommending to you that you use RO water, RO standing for reverse osmosis, or boil your water. Now here's the problem with boiling. When you boil your water, all you're doing, well, you will hit organisms that die at high temperatures. And I put it that way because with some of the mutations and some of the bacteria, viruses, and fungi, they're developing skins that are so hard that boiling the water doesn't even touch them. So that's one thing. Number two, like we talked about the trihalomethanes, gases like that get concentrated when you boil them. So in fact, as well as some of those heavy metals. So all you're doing is concentrating them, and they're all in the bottom of your bottom of your pot or whatever it is that you boiled with. So that doesn't work. But that's what the government to date has recommended to folks to do. Boil your water. No good. Okay. As we move from that into the next spectrum of things, and we start going into what other things do we need to look at in the water, let's take a look at pH, which was one of those items on that list in terms of looking at purity. Now here in this area, and I have this beautiful chart behind me because many of you have probably seen it and not paid too much attention to it. This is a chart that reflects the aquifer here in this region. Now, what is an aquifer? That's a particular bowl, we'll use that term, that all the groundwater seeps into. So this particular aquifer is a very large one. And the bowl is very large, and all of your water comes from that aquifer. Now this is a very peculiar aquifer in that it's the type of aquifer that whatever's on the surface gets into the groundwater or gets into that bowl. So whether I'm over in Tumwater or I'm here in Yelm, anything on the surface, so somebody pours oil down a drain here or in Lacey, it's going to get into that bowl and be a factor that we draw our water from. Now all the pink areas up there are areas that are in trouble. This aquifer is in trouble as it relates to acidity, as it relates to what's on the surface getting into the bottom. This is from the state. This chart was given out by the state officials. When I started asking questions about, I said to them, I'm probably the only one in this entire region that tests their water 2 or 3 times a day. Why is our water having a pH below 7.0? And 7.0 is where it's a neutral point. It's where you want to have your drinking water, to at least be at 7.0. And in testing, we were getting anywhere from 6.3 to 7.3. And I wanted to know, why is our water so acid there? They couldn't answer me. They still don't know. But it's a problem. If I look at pH on another perspective, how much acid is in the water, and I go to Long Island, New York, I find just the opposite. There we have pHs at 8.5, 8.0. And I said, wow, okay, so this is going to be great water here? What's going on? You know, it's very interesting to me. I just call them coinky-dinks. But I just happened to be in the right places at the right time. And the Sunday while I was there, the newspaper in New York just happened to run an article on the groundwater on Long Island. And the Brookhaven Institute is located, has been based there for over 45 years in Long Island. And the problem is they had been dumping some of their chemicals into the ground. And the groundwater was contaminated. Contaminated so badly that the government had, of course, taken measures by putting lime into the water to try to get the pH up. And so the pH standardly was 8.5. But I knew from some of the patients that I had there that, as an example, we had kids with cleft palates in one square block. I'm sorry, correct on that. In one hospital, within a 1-year period, 11 children were born with cleft palate. Now, the chances of that happening by accident are like 1 in a million are the normal numbers for that. 11 children in one hospital, all coming from the same geographical area, had cleft palate. Goes even further. In one block, within 1 year, 11 women had breast cancer, all, again, on Long Island. I say there's something wrong here. Just your good old common sense tells you there's something common here that's factoring in. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But you can see that being too acidic and being too alkaline can have its problems. So you don't necessarily want to do that. In Arizona and New Mexico right now, they have the problem of too much alkalinity. In fact, their water's starting at 7.8 and going up. And people are having problems from too much alkalinity in their water. So this is a vast country here. Waters will vary in different regions, and that needs to be kept in mind. Now, I put up here this equation called the equation of life, because this is an equation that was rediscovered by Dr. Carey Reams shortly after the turn of the century. Now, equation of life, because this holds for humans, it holds for plants, and it holds for animals. This is a basic equation of life. If the soil is too acid, if the soil is too alkaline, disease will enter the plants grown in that soil, or they will be weak. If things are balanced, you'll get a tremendous yield, and again, the plants will be strong. The same thing happens with animals. Their pH. As long as they fall along this equation, they will be free of disease. And you'll note there that we are looking at the pH of the urine and the pH of the saliva, which is reflective of the buildup in the body, how we break down our foodstuffs and how we take these foodstuffs and try to make them incorporate them into our bodies. So pH ideally should be 6.4 in both of those elements in order for the body to be diseased. Now, it doesn't rely totally on pH, because as you look at glucose here, it's also how the body handles carbohydrates, how it handles mineral salts, and also when I look at nitrates and ammonia, how we break down flesh protein, which would be meat, seafood, and poultry, and on the nitrate side, and as we look at ammonia, how we handle vegetable protein. Next slide, please. Now, as we look at this and showing you the significance of that, we find that in this narrow pH of 6.4, we absorb all the minerals. And as we move away from that pH of 6.4, we find that there are certain minerals we can't absorb. So as an example, if we look at the next slide, but note before we change that, it's a little bit difficult to see from a different distance, that we're at both ends of the spectrum here. If you're too acid, you don't absorb them, but also if you're too alkaline, you can't absorb them. And, okay, you'll note there that at a pH of 5.8 is where we begin to absorb calcium. So that if your body does not have a pH, meaning your urine and saliva does not have a pH of at least 5.8, you can't absorb calcium. And as we go on today, we'll let you figure out the significance of being able to absorb that calcium. But if I look at manganese, which you can absorb until you have a pH of 6.0. If you look at eggs and sperm, there's no egg or sperm that will develop, whether it's in a peach or whether it's in you, if you do not have sufficient quantities of manganese in the body. Well, you can't even absorb manganese until you have a pH of at least 6.0. So we wonder about the number of infertile young women and men we have out there anxiously trying to have children and having difficulty producing viable eggs and sperm. Many of them are too acidic and cannot absorb enough manganese to even produce sperm and egg that would be viable. Then you add to that what we said earlier in terms of the frogs, If the frog eggs and sperm are bringing up mutations and defects, what do you think is going to happen to your sperm and your eggs if you're drinking the same water? You get an idea that water isn't just a casual little thing here that, you know, you can see through when you hold up a glass. There's got to be more to it than that. Okay, now, you say to me, Doc, when I look at these minerals here, what significance is that? So I can't absorb, I mean, above the sperm and the egg situation, or I can't absorb calcium. What else does it mean? You can go on to the next slide with the tube. If I cannot absorb my minerals, I like to put the minerals, or make them tantamount to air in an inner tube. If I can't get enough air, if I can't get enough minerals to a particular organ, then I'm going to suddenly get this little outpouching on the side of the organ. Now, in a human body or in an animal, that would be tantamount to a cyst. You know, this little outpouch on the side of the inner tube. I keep going along. This lasts for, say, a year. Now I've got a permanent outpouching on the side of that inner tube, on the side of that organ. That would be tantamount to a tumor. And all of that is because I can't get sufficient minerals to those organs. You know, the one we can see, the biggest organ we got is our skin. So you start seeing cysts and things on your skin, imagine what the other organs look like. And each organ has a different percentage of minerals that it needs in order for it to grow or to be, you know, in peak performance. So let's say the brain says, well, I like a lot of calcium and I like a little potassium, you know, and let's see, throw in a little magnesium. That I need to just have my brain function. And if not, I'm going to begin to develop cysts in my brain. Or my thyroid. Hey, it needs calcium, it needs potassium too. But it needs it in different percentages than my brain does. And every organ in the body has its own percentage there in terms of what it needs and whether or not these little outpouchings will begin. These cysts, these tumors will begin. Now, if this goes along long enough, or the mix has been strong enough, I might find that I can't get any air at all. I can't get any minerals at all to those organs. That's when we call, it would be comparable to a flat tire. You know, that tire's not going to roll at all. That would be called, in energy circles, a delta cell. Another term for that would be a free radical. All that's when an organ cannot get the minerals that it needs and the energy given off of those minerals. If you take the next slide. The other term that we use for delta cell or free radical would be cancer cell. Now, how many of you have seen, if I add water to some metal or leave it outdoors for a while and it hasn't been appropriately coated, it begins to do what? It begins to rust, okay? Rust is the same as a free radical. It's the same as decay. It's the same as the word oxidation or oxidant. The metal is oxidizing just by adding water to it. It is not getting what it needs. Something has to counteract that. So for purposes today, we're going to look at rust on metal as you rusting on the inside, or your organs decaying. Basically, again, why did that happen? Because we couldn't get the appropriate minerals to them. So then you say, okay, I'm beginning to put two and two together here, but how do I do that? And what prevents me from doing that? Well, if I think for a moment and had to pick an organ in the body that was the most important organ, can you guess what that organ might be besides the brain? We'll take the brain as number one. But what other organ do you think? Heart's an important organ, but believe it or not, I could still have cells going, even if the heart slows down. I mean, there are other ways to keep the chemical and the cells vibrating, okay? I think I heard it over here. Give me another guess. What other organ? Skin is the biggest organ we got, so it tells you what's going on in all those other organs because we can see it, okay? The liver. The liver is your workhorse. Everything filters through the liver, okay? We tend to think, and if you could find that slide on the digestive tract behind spiny, we tend to look at the digestive tract, I think, a little erroneously. And one way that we look at it is we think that everything goes through your liver, through your pancreas, through your gallbladder, etc. Guys, the digestive tract is one long tube, open on either end, here and the anus on the other end, okay? And so what starts here in your eating goes through this long tube, 30 feet of it, and comes out on the other end. Food going through. Now, in the process of going down that tube, different things are added in. And particularly in the stomach is the machine that breaks it down so that the juices from that can enter your bloodstream. And it's through the blood that things are taken to the liver. And from there, things are dispersed throughout the body. So that you can imagine, just for a moment, that the liver is the thing that's going to determine where everything gets distributed, including how much potassium do I have to send up to the thyroid? How much calcium do I have to send to the teeth? If not enough is coming to that liver, or if the liver is jammed with a lot of toxic material, then it can't do its job. So it'll be working, let's say, at 50% performance. So I can't manufacture and distribute everything that I need. I only can send 50% of it. That's when those organs begin to die. So if the liver is overloaded with toxins, it can't do its job. So I'm very interested in something that will affect the liver, that will allow it to be cleaned out if necessary, and will strengthen it so that it can do its job. Now, Dr. Kerry Reams, I mentioned earlier in reference to the pH chart and the equation of life, and he's one of the few scientists in the world. He lived about the time that Einstein and Edison and all those beautiful physicists. He was also a biophysicist, where Einstein worked with E equals mc squared, Reams worked with mc squared equals E, or can I turn material into energy? And they respected each other. He tested 280,000 foodstuffs for the spin of their electron. And if you can imagine for a minute just that's the impact of that. If I have electrons all spinning in this direction, okay, and all of a sudden I have another one going in the opposite direction, where these things overlap, there's resistance. Go either way you want. I got resistance because of this overlap. That resistance I want. And there's been quite a bit of controversy out there about food combinations or whatever. Well, I can't eat that, because if I eat that, it'll cause a lot of energy to be given off, and there'll be a lot of resistance, and I don't want that. Guys, you want just the opposite. You do want that resistance, because that resistance is the energy that you live off of. So if we've got a whole slew of electrons going this way, and all of a sudden I add one foodstuff out of those 280,000 foods that spun in the other direction, the electrons spun in the other direction, I think many of you can guess, but guess what that foodstuff was? The lemon. Its electrons spin just the opposite from all the other foodstuffs. And it creates that overlap, that resistance, so that that energy is what, we live off of. Now, I think it's very interesting, and, nature makes no accidents. If you look at the lemon, what does it look like? It looks like the sun. Nice, bright yellow, very powerful fruit. In fact, it's been very fashionable to add lemon to your water in many restaurants. I'm sure they have no idea what they're doing, but it's the best thing in the world they could ask. Now, when we start talking about current and electricity in the body, Edison discovered direct current. In other words, things going in one direction, the way most of those electrons spin. Tesla came along, looked up at the sun and said, I've got to figure out the way the sun does it. And the way the sun does it is the way adding lemon to your water does it. It causes things to spin in two directions. Now all of a sudden I have what we call alternating current. And we find that it takes less energy to get to an end point. Where direct current, I might be able to light up the town of Yelm. With alternating current, the same amount, I could light up the entire eastern Washington state. You get a sense of I'm much more efficient with alternating energy, so that I would want my liver to be operating like an alternating energy thing, more so than I would want it to act like direct current or an inefficient direct current type of energy. Well, when I add that lemon to your water, your liver just loves it. And in fact, Dr. Reams also found that the liver is loaded with the kind of hydrogen that's given off by the lemon. And these are what we call negatively charged hydrogens, H with a minus to it. That particular hydrogen allows the liver to work at peak performance. And from infancy, roughly to 5 years of age, your liver is loaded with these negatively charged hydrogens. You're born with them. So it wants to keep it at that level. So anything that you can give back to the body that will allow those negatively charged hydrogens to be in big numbers would allow that liver to work at peak performance. So we can begin, and I've probably been responsible for lemon prices being as high as they have over the last couple of years, just simply by this and lecturing in several cities. But we can start with just simply having lemon juice in terms of that. And all of, or most of the waters that we're going to talk about today all deal with adding negatively charged hydrogens to the liver, so that it allows the livers to be cleaned up and allows them to work at peak performance. Now, for a moment, I'm going to have you reflect on being a big battery, or your brain being a big battery. And some of you will say, really? Yes, you're a big battery. In fact, you're nothing but a big ball of energy, period. But we'll save that for another discussion. And on each of these topics, we could probably lecture for an hour on each. But because of timing, let's see if we can piece them all together here. The brain is nothing but a big battery. And if I were to ask you, if your battery went dead in your car, what would be the first thing you'd check to see whether or not there was something wrong with your battery? You want to know if there was enough water in your battery, or there was enough acid, meaning the plates were working okay, so you had enough acid to it. So guess what, folks? What does your brain take to be sure that the electricity is flowing appropriately in you? It takes water, and it takes acid. Same scenario. Now, our brains are roughly 90% water. Now, there are some situations where the percentage of water in the brain can get as high as 99%, and that would be ideal. But I'll say that most folks on the earth are functioning with water at 90%. That would be the ideal for them. Many of you are functioning with water levels around 70%. If your skin is dry, which again is the largest organ you have, if you're beginning to get wrinkles, then you recognize that there's not enough water in your body. Because wrinkles, again, that's the organ you can see. And it is reflecting to you what the rest of your organs look like. In fact, let me just take a moment here and say that through the studies that have been done, we know that at age 40, you have routinely 45% less water than you had when you were 5 years of age. We're really at the place that we're talking about, you don't age, you dry up. And I want you to reflect on that a minute. By age 70, you have half of that amount of water in your body that you had at age 40. Now, one of the strongest arguments I've seen for not being overweight is what happens in obesity in age and water. Being obese at age 40, you have 63% less water in your body than someone else who's not obese. If you're 70 years old and are still obese, you'll find that you have 63% cut that 45%, cut that in half. So you have half the amount of water in your system that a normal 70-year-old would have. So good arguments, folks, for keeping those cells nice and wet. Good arguments for letting things happen. Now, as we look at this, and an important scenario here is as I look at the different addictions that we have up here, and for those of you having difficulty seeing this, on one side we have salt, caffeine, nicotine, and cocaine. On the other side we have sugar, alcohol, tranquilizers, marijuana, and heroin. Now, I've grouped these together because they have different effects on the body and on the brain. On the salt cocaine side, there's a tendency to use those things to try to speed the brain up. It's like they're stuck in quicksand. They need a jump start. And all of those items act like something that the brain makes naturally, which is tryptophan, which is the body's natural painkiller. So these are people that are holding on to things, trying to get rid of them, having pain inside, and thus the tryptophan type of things, salt all the way to caffeine, sort of give them a jump start. So you can think of the number of people that have to have their 5 cups of coffee a day. Salt is added like crazy to their system. They're holding on to stuff, okay? On the other side of the equation, we've got people craving sugar. And, you know, I don't put any judgments on these things because it's just as hard to come off of sugar as it is to come off of heroin. These things tend to slow the brain down so that they can function. And you will often find individuals on that side of the equation whose brains feel like they're running the 100-yard dash every day. These things try to slow them down a bit so that they can think and they can function. Now, I've gone here because, again, you can see the importance of that battery operating appropriately. If you were to ask any of these persons, any person addicted to any of these things, how much water they drink, unless they've seen me already, most of them will tell you they hate water. If they get 1 good glass in a day, it's a miracle. And in fact, if you were to talk to heroin addicts, and this came from some studies I did at Hopkins around 1990, with heroin addicts and cocaine addicts that had been addicts for over 20-some years. They'd survived the system that long, but they've been around for a while. And if you ask them how much water they drank, they tell you they hate water. One of the things we learned from turning around these particular folks so that they had no longer withdrawal symptoms and in fact could get off the drugs was simply getting them to drink water. And we did a simple thing with them. I did a simple thing with the patients that I was involved with, and I gave them an option. I said, if I could get you so that you were no longer addicted to the drug that you're addicted to, you had no withdrawal symptoms, would you be interested? 1/3 said, no, I like the drug, I really don't want to stop. The other 1/3 said, I don't believe it can happen, so I'm not interested. And the other 1/3 said, yes. And within a couple of months, we got all of those people so that they were no longer chemically addicted to the drug that they were on, just by getting them to drink water. Now, another interesting thing, and a reason I pulled this up also, is that we find the individuals on that sugar side, heroin side, alcohol side, have a tendency to have very fast-moving brains. Their brains are processing information so fast that they tend to go to these things to try to get a common denominator here so that they can function, so they can think. So they had a tendency to be pulled to these things just to slow their brains down. And in fact, when we did a survey of the prison system in Maryland, we found that 65% of the individuals in the Maryland Penitentiary for that year were all dyslexic or had attention deficit disorder. I hate that term. I don't like the disorder part of it because there are geniuses sitting in prisons. There are geniuses often addicted to a number of these things because their brains are processing information so fast. The deficit is in us with not knowing how we're going to teach them. But if I've got a fast-moving brain, I need jet fuel to keep up with that brain. And if we can jump ahead to the periodic table for just a minute, and we're going to take a break in about 5 minutes here. But if I were to look at this chemical periodic table, and I look smack dab in the middle of that table, and for purposes here, I'm going to look here at titanium, and I'm going to look at platinum, PT and titanium. And in the middle of this, I have some very unstable elements, particularly rubidium and iridium I'm going to point to for just a minute, but just to show you that those things fall smack dab in the middle of the periodic table. And for most chemists and physicists, we really don't know what those elements are about. We know that when energy, particularly heat, is given to those elements, they begin to process very, very fast. In the last 3 years, because we didn't have the equipment before this to be able to detect this, we found that in human brains, they're loaded with iridium and rhodium. In fact, the younger the individual is, the more iridium and rhodium there is in their brain. Now, we haven't done the study to take our fast-moving attention deficit disorder individuals or dyslexics and look at their brain. But I would suspect very strongly that they're loaded with iridium and rhodium. The babies have a lot of iridium and rhodium in their brain, but what do you have to do the first couple of years of life? You've got to learn everything about your environment, how to walk, how to talk, how to read, how to do all of those things. And in the National Education Association statistics, they find that from infancy to 5 years of age, your learning curve goes like this. At 5 years of age, something happens, and for the rest of your life, it goes down. What do we have happening at 5 years of age? They all go to school and get processed out of them. They would continue to learn at the rapid pace that they did. We also find in those 5 years of age, you're introduced to a lot of foodstuffs and different toxins. So again, your learning curve begins to go down. I'm going to stop here because it's a good natural break. This has been just a general base for you to build upon. Now let's look at what we can do. Now there's been a lot of confusion these days, in particular, just because there's so many water products on the market. And people just don't have a ruler to sort of use to gauge, well, what is this one about, and what do I use this one for, and can I use them all? You know, where do I place these things, you know, in the order of things? So I've tried to look at common denominators and not so common denominators in each of the things that many of you are familiar with, just to give you some guidance going through this maze. When I begin to look at things, I'd start off by just saying that all of the bioavailable waters cluster, all water clusters. And in fact, here's the other one. Yeah. Clustering is just a natural occurrence in nature, and if we look at the grapes there for a minute, we can look at the grape clusters for a minute and then come back to that one. just this cluster of grapes, if I could have you keep that picture in your mind, in the back of your minds, and get an idea that this is a naturally occurring shape of a group of elements. And many, many things repeat that shape in the body that are good for you, including water. Water itself, when the molecules come together, actually look like a cluster of grapes. And many of you are aware that we're finding out in the medical literature these days just the importance of the grape as an antioxidant for treating cancer and for treating heart disease. So again, there are no accidents in nature, and if we study nature, we'll have the clues to everything we need to make these bodies work. In fact, you're just smaller representations of a larger part of the earth. So if things work in a larger picture, they also work for you. You're just a small example of a whole planet. And so if you can imagine that clustered things in a cluster that grow in a cluster or form that way are some of the best things for you, that'll get us started. Now, if we go to the next slide in terms of cluster size, regular tap water itself, as you can see from this, forms in a cluster of roughly what we would say 13 to 15 grapes, or 13 to 15 little spheres within its cluster. And the size of the cluster does make a difference in terms of how it responds in the body. So you'll note that tap water is at the top here, and mineral water here, by that we mean the routine mineral water that you could get bottled from just about anywhere these days. And I would have you to begin to read the labels on your water bottles. Now, up until October of this year, there was not, which hasn't occurred yet, there has not been a demand that the FDA has given to the manufacturer. Prior to this, no one was required to put on their labels everything that was in their water or to put the water source. It was only a year ago that they even had to put on the label what was in the water. As of October of this year, all the government sources will be required to tell the public what is in their water. So that's going to be an interesting occurrence coming up in a couple of months. Now, in the bottling industry, still, they have not been required to divulge their water sources. And a couple of years ago, you could go out here and hook your hose up to, you know, your backyard stream and call your water Pacific Northwest beautiful water and could bottle and sell it without any regulations at all. I mean, the industry is still there to an extent. It's just that many in the industry are looking close now. So it'd be very difficult for someone to do that any longer. But as we move into these bioavailable waters, I suspect that you're going to see some charlatans out there who will not understand the things that you'll understand by the end of this afternoon. And so simply say, well, I can just put a bucket of water up there and call it magic water from Mars. And people will believe it and use it. You see, so we have to sort through that that maze out there and know what kinds of questions to ask, know what to examine, what to look for, to understand how perhaps this water could be helpful to you in terms of helping your body or just be nothing. So with that in mind, the size of the cluster does make a difference. And as you can see here, the smaller the cluster, the easier it is by size to allow this water to get into the tissues of the body. And the cells themselves actually respond to the small size of the clustered water. So you will want to be on the smaller end, like roughly 7 to 9 molecules per cluster is where you want to be in a cluster size. There are precise energies that are needed to make atoms and molecules respond. So being in a cluster format, it's like things are touching each other. Each one of those grapes touch each other. Or if we look at things in terms of an onion skin, there's spheres that actually, if I drop water, if I drop an object into the center of some still water, rings go out from where I've dropped it in the water. Remember those pictures of just it getting bigger and bigger, the wing or the wave that goes out? That's the same way in which things are transmitted through these clusters throughout the body. So if I drink water here in my mouth, that water will cascade down, ringing to the different cells in the body, getting broader and broader in terms of what cells it affects as it goes through my digestive tract. Now, these are happening at very small sized elements. You know, I mean, my body's pretty big, and you can imagine the ring getting bigger and bigger, but let's say we're at minute size, smaller than you can see with a human eye. These rings are beginning to emanate out, starting in the mouth, attaching to proteins, and going from the mouth to the esophagus to the digestive tract, and beginning to almost ring a bell in terms of they're touching each other or communicating or sending information to each of the cells. So we want to keep that in mind for just a minute. Now, I've put this up here as a six-sided figure. And believe it or not, all of the bioavailable waters have the same shape. It's a six-pointed star. What else occurs naturally in nature that these gemstones, the ruby, the sapphire, the emerald, all have that six-pointed star shape. All of them. All of the waters that we've listed up here, all of the waters that we've listed up here, all have a six-sided figure to them when they're in their bioavailable state. So that's a common denominator for all of them. There are no mistakes in nature. Now this is another shape and another star. And this particular star is a five-pointed star. That's the shape of the distilled water in nature. It looks like a five-pointed star. When we add silica to the water at a colloidal size, and I'll explain what I mean there in just a minute, this five-sided figure pointed star. So if I were to look with the instruments that we now have to be able to look at the shape of these water molecules, this is what it looks like. Again, getting smaller than the cluster now. And if I had the instrumentation, and there's been one instrument in the world that will allow us to take a look at this, and it was developed by a Russian scientist who is quite a being in terms of his intellectual knowledge, and he's developed this one-of-a-kind instrument in the world that we can actually take pictures of what the water molecules look like at their tiniest size. And when they become bioavailable, meaning when they begin to exert their activity, they all shift to this five-pointed star shape. No one knows at this point how long they stay in that five-pointed, what we call a pentamer shape. That's still hot investigation. Someone will probably get a Nobel Prize for it in terms of seeing when does that transition take place. Now, in this shape, it's also like a crystal of calcium, which also changes from six to five-pointed shapes as it becomes available in the body. So cluster size, the smaller the better. And I didn't say to you, you want it smaller because you want to cross the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain tissue. Now, I can take regular tap water and drink it, and it'll be hours before it gets to my brain. But the smaller clustered waters will immediately go to the brain and cross that blood-brain barrier, and thus I'm putting jet fuel in a jet engine. You see? So if we're going to have 90% water up there, let's give it the best, and let's allow it to get there. So the smaller clustered size allows penetrability not only in the brain tissue, but also into your other organs. And if you give me the slide, I think, I'm not sure where it is there, just about that we have membranes throughout our body. In fact, we have electrolysis membranes throughout our body. They're in our brain, they're in our skin, they're in our lungs, they're in our heart, they're in our intestines, they're in our kidney. So they have electrolysis membranes, and that was work done by Dr. Van Nordstrom several years ago. And they're still sorting that out, even though he put that out almost 10 years ago. What does that mean? It means that the body's membranes act like electrolysis units within your system, converting things into different elements than what they were in the beginning. Now, this is a list of the particular electrolysis membranes that he tested in the body. Can you go into a healthy cell for me for just a minute? We hear the word colloid or colloid. We say, what does that mean? A colloid is the smallest particle that we can detect by any of the instrumentation that we have in the body or outside of the body. So you can think of it as the smallest particle that we can actually pick up and examine. That's a colloid. A colloid is neither a solid or a liquid or a gas. It's somewhere in between a solid and a liquid. You can think of a balloon floating on an ocean. That's where a colloid sort of fits. It sort of doesn't fit nicely into any particular category. Now, all foods and all minerals are converted to colloids in order to be able to get into a cell. So they're broken down to their finest, smallest element in order to interface or do something with a cell. I got to break it down that small. Now, what I put up here was what a healthy cell looks like. And to be noted here is that there is a negative charge on the outside of the cell, and that charge should be negative. On the inside of the cell, it should be positive. And the amount of charge that's there, this is the ideal cell. This is the cell, according to Reams's equation, when everything is working at peak performance. This is what it looks like. And that's called zeta potential, that balance of charges, that extra charge on the outside. Now, when that zeta potential, when those negative charges begin to disappear, disease gets into the body. So I want a high zeta potential. And that's all it means, that the charge that the overall cell is left with should be a negative one. And that's called zeta potential. You're going to see these terms, and I want them to have some meaning to you. So the lower that zeta potential, the worse the cell is. I want a high zeta potential. Now, if we look up here, remember we talked about pH? You see 7.3 for the pH outside of the cell, or what we call the cytoplasm. That's the liquid sort of surrounding the cell. And that is where we look at the blood pH. And when we talk about pH in the blood, I have a very narrow margin there. That shouldn't move off of 7.3. In fact, if I come down lower than 1/10 of a point in the blood, or go up 1/10 of the blood, I'll send you to the intensive care unit. Your body can't tolerate those kinds of movements in the blood. Okay, so 7.3 for the blood, 6.4 to 6.6 for the urine and saliva, the rest of the system. And if you'll notice, in the inside of the cell, the pH is 6.6. So inside of the cell, 6.6, outside of the cell, 7.3 pH. That's where we want to be to make this cell operate at peak performance. Now, you'll see a little cloud, 5-sided figure there, which we call a rosetta. Now, you guys are getting some of the latest of what's happening in physics around the world with this particular slide. And one of the problems we have in water is that we've always looked at it from the chemical perspective. We've not looked at it from the physics perspective. And all these colloidal physicists and nuclear physicists and quantum physicists or whatever all have them parlaying in their complicated conferences, having no idea that if you just knew what they knew, the doctors over here could help with some of the diseases. No one talks to the other. Well, in just this slide, this is a combination of biophysics, biochemistry, biology, and medicine. The latest of the information in the world in terms of what's going on. And just that little Rosetta Stone, it took them a century to discover it. Now that's a five-sided figure. That's the portal. It attaches the protein, and that's the way things get into a cell, through that portal, through that rosetta. And that allows all the nutrients, everything you eat, anything introduced to the body, including water, to get into the cell. It goes into that rosetta. Now, if you'll notice that little kite-like structure off to the side, you see what's in the center of it. Ca stands for calcium. And it's like a kite. Calcium is the thing that most naturally surrounds the cell and helps to maintain those pHs at 7.3. Water itself, again, when it becomes bioavailable, looks like a crystal of calcium. Calcium looks like a crystal in its colloidal structure. Looks like a 6-pointed figure that converts to a 5-pointed figure when it interfaces with the cell. Crystal. Your water looks just like it. It becomes a crystal. It becomes essentially a hard substance. A 6-pointed and 5-pointed hard substance that's not really hard, because we said a colloid was neither a solid nor a liquid nor a gas. It's falling somewhere in the middle there, okay? But when things are ideal, that kite, which will be representative of minerals, and when you add vitamin D to it, so why do I say to you, you need to take vitamin D, or make sure you have enough vitamin D to be able to absorb your calcium? This is what it means. It means that in order for that calcium, or whatever the mineral is, to get into the cell, the pH has to be right. The rosetta has to be sitting there perfectly ready to allow the kite to just go right through that portal. It brings with it enzymes. It brings with it hormones right into the cell. Now, can we switch to an unhealthy cell for a minute? Now, I put this up here because this represents an unhealthy cell. And what we have going on here, you see our rosetta here, it's blocked. There's a bubble around it. This is what happens when our pH drops. Suddenly, number one, we get an extra membrane around the cell, and things are having difficulty getting in. They cannot get in. Those same minerals and things can't get into this cell. And in fact, a whole extra bubble forms around the cell. And the cell begins to eat itself. It begins to liquefy and eat itself. This is an unhealthy situation. Enzymes begin to deteriorate. So we have even a different set of enzymes that operate. They can't get in. Now, what was all of this about? We just changed the pH. We made it more acidic. That in turn changed the shape of many things inside of the system. Calcium can't get in here. It's trying. It can't. It's blocked. I can't get into the cell. The cell actually begins to eat itself. So you can see the importance here of just having the pH right. Something as simple as that. Now, thank you. If I look at the different waters that we've been talking about, again, there's some common denominators, and then there's some not so common denominators. And I thought that I'd try to pull forth some of the common denominators. If I look at infectious agents, as long as that cell looks unhealthy, like the last picture, infectious agents are actually pulled into the center of that cell. They can get in when the pH is off, when things are too acidic. They're actually pulled into the center of the cell. We spoke of lead. We spoke of mercury. I didn't mention cadmium, but cadmium would be another heavy metal that's in our environment and often in our water systems. They are easily pulled into the center of those cells when that cell pH is off. So you can see again the importance of having the right pH available, having the right thing communicating with that cell. The two waters of all of those that are on the list here, and I've tried to list some of the better waters that are on the market right now, the better bioavailable waters. Common denominator, again, they all have the six-sided figure to them. Common denominator. In two of the oldest waters on the planet right now, I would zero in on the electrolysis for the moment and the deuterium waters. Now, why do I zero in on those? Because most of the research has zeroed in on those. So the academics, they've been around long enough that there are academic studies that have actually been done that you could take to the bank or to court and say, see, I didn't poison my child. I've got studies to show that this works, you know, that kind of thing. And it's not to say that the others don't have them yet. It's too early in the game. We've had brilliant scientists to discover some of these things, and the studies are in progress. But we don't have them totally yet to be able to hang our hat on and say that they work. Now, because water is looked at as a nutritional substance, in fact, the FDA doesn't know where to put it. When we look at medication itself, medicine has a cause and effect. If I give you this, I expect this result from it. That's the old format. That's the way in which we have sort of operated here in the United States for the last little shy of 100 years. Another way of looking at that would be, can I zero in on what caused things in the first place and try to correct that deficit? Now, that's a subtle but very different approach. And when you're dealing with nutritional substances that I am putting water in, because that's the way it's looked at, you're looking at what can it give back to the body to restore what it needs, to allow it to be balanced and to be free of disease. Now, it's a very subtle difference, but a very important one. If I were to show you what medicine does to that same cell model up there, you'll find that only 1% of the medication that you take actually gets into the cell. 99% doesn't do anything, and in fact encourages that cell to get into an unhealthy position. So I feel very strongly that we need to change our whole mode here and start looking at what is the cell missing that we need to restore, as opposed to what I'm going to give you that may make you feel better but may not do anything for your body. If I give you an aspirin, that doesn't really give you anything. That doesn't restore anything to your body. It makes you feel better. Your headache goes away. But I haven't corrected the condition that started the headache in the first place. You get the principle that we're operating from, and why you're going to see a different kind of research coming out. And it takes different parameters to be measured in order to understand how and if and why these waters would interface with the body. Okay? And my gracious, you talk about water, I mean, it doesn't have any color to it. I mean, it all looks alike. I mean, how are these things different? You know, what's going on here? So having said that, in one of the arenas, looking at the electrolysis water, which was discovered originally by the Russians also around the turn of the century, but they weren't so good to their scientists that discovered this. In fact, they took his research, locked him away, and so therefore they didn't get very far with the blessing that was given to them in terms of water, because of how they treated the scientist that was given the information. The Japanese picked up on it about 25 years ago, and they began to explore the water, and so right now are the leaders in the world when it comes to electrolyzed water. But as we look at infectious agents, and here I'm talking about bacteria, viruses, and fungi, there's a paper that's about to be released in October of this year where they have looked at the effects on bacteria and the immune system with electrolyzed waters. Now, I'm going to back up and say that I don't know how many of you remember the Ebola epidemic that took place in Zaire and Gabon about 5 years ago now, and people were getting this plague. I mean, in 72 hours they were dead, and it sort of stopped. Well, believe it or not, what stopped that epidemic was the electrolyzed water, the microwater, that was sent to the Center for Communicable Diseases here in Atlanta, and that's what stopped that epidemic. They actually cleaned up the camps, they cleaned up the water using electrolyzed water. Now, when we look at infectious agents, and again, I say to you, with the clustered water, I do know that a study was underway, a microbiological study. The students at the University of Mexico rioted for purposes of trying to get their fees reduced, and they totally destroyed the microbiological lab that the set of studies were going on for the clustered water, at least on this side of the ocean. So they were disrupted, so that's going to delay the microbiological studies there. Microbiology in deuterium has been going on since at least 1942. So there are a number of studies around infectious diseases and deuterium. Colloidal silver, many of you were around when we had syphilis was a real problem up until the 1930s. And during that time, people used to be injected with silver to try to treat syphilis. Penicillin was allowed to be released. It was discovered well before then, but they finally let it be released, and now penicillin is the antibiotic that's used for syphilis. But silver is used in the treatment to prevent syphilis from mothers that may be infected with syphilis, and as the baby comes through the birth canal, we actually put silver drops in the eyes of the infants to keep the child from getting syphilis. I mean, it's an old thing, but it's still done in every hospital in the world to prevent herpes and syphilis from the babies getting it, because that was a major problem, a real public health issue for years. So silver has been around in terms of a bacteriostatic agent. Now, what do I mean by bacteriostatic? Here we mean to keep the levels down versus being able to treat or kill. Silver has been known to keep the levels down, but it does not kill the organisms. Now, it appears in what Mr. Rowland has done with his water is to add frequency to it, which we'll get to in just a minute. So you're keeping the levels down, but then you're adding frequency to it also. I say that because the studies have not come forth in terms of actual documentation above its use with E. coli. So the silver, he does have the documented studies in reference to E. coli and its effects, but not for any of the other organisms. It's looking pretty good in the arena of viruses, specifically herpes, but those studies have not been completed yet. When I look at the electrolyzed water as it relates to organisms, we've talked about the plague or the Ebola epidemic and that being stopped by it. But they also have found that this water kills on contact. Not 20 minutes later, 15 or 20 minutes later. Well, if I give you chlorine, which we talked about earlier, but it's a bleach, we tend to use that to wash our counters down and wash our clothes with the idea that it's going to kill bacteria and things that would be in our clothing. It normally takes 15 to 20 minutes to have that happen. When we use the low pH microwater on the acid side, what we find is that it kills on contact. So here you have an environmentally safe element that you can use for cleaning and for sterilization. In Japan, they actually sterilize their instruments. They wash down the surgical suites just with that water. So again, you can see applications. In the meat industry, you see them washing down the carcasses with the water. It kills E. coli on contact. We wouldn't have the issue that we have now here in the United States with E. coli in the meat packing plants or in the restaurants or in catering houses if they just used electrolyzed water. Just to show you that the technology exists. But for some reason, we're not there yet here in the United States. And every time I hear another E. coli epidemic, I get a bit perturbed because I know the technology exists very simply to be able to just offer that and save a few lives. Now, they also found that the polio virus, type 3, is killed within 60 seconds using the electrolyzed water. The HIV and hepatitis bacterium are also killed within 30 seconds. Now, these are the documented studies that are out. Sort of makes you wonder, why are we still running around with these diseases when this stuff exists on a worldwide basis? The paper that's coming out in October is showing that in addition to the organisms that I've just mentioned, that T lymphocytes and memory T cells, now these are all cells that are in the body that are there to boost your immune system so that you can fight off bad infections, or you can fight off or give a boost and prevent having cancer. The paper is going to demonstrate that there is a boost in SOD activity, and in the T lymphocytes, their level is maintained so they don't drop, and there's a boost to the memory T cells. So it will allow your immune system to respond to infectious things and to work against cancer. In the B cells, which are there for allergies, now you tend to get a whole slew of B cells in your system, think of them as little bees. When you have allergies, those drop when they're introduced to the electrolyzed waters. So these are documented studies that you can give people something to hang their hats on, when it happens. In addition to that, lupus, they've noticed, now these are in mice studies, the lifespan of the mice has been increased by 2 months just by them drinking electrolyzed water. Now, that's tantamount to about 10 years in a human with individuals who have lupus. In rheumatoid arthritis, we get a similar increase in lifespan. Again, just drinking electrolyzed water. Now, something that we have found in the last couple of months. Now, in the last couple of years, you've heard about ulcers, and we all used to think about giving milk to individuals with ulcers. I don't know if you remember those days when everybody drank milk if they had an ulcer. Well, if you'll remember, about 1.5 years ago, we identified an organism, a bacteria, that was a cause for the ulcer in the stomach. Now, when I was in medical school and still in medical school, they're taught that bacteria cannot grow in the digestive tract because the acids are too strong in the stomach. And just past the stomach, now you have 2 organs just past the stomach that hit the small intestines. One would be the gallbladder, and it's squirting its juices, which are alkaline. Again, pH stuff, guys. Alkaline, okay, the higher pH, to try to counterbalance the acid coming off the stomach. You just left the stomach. Now we got to cool that acid stuff down, those juices, so that they're not so acidic. So bowel, comes from the gallbladder to try to counteract it or make things not so acidic. So you have a strong alkali, therefore, coming off of the first part of the intestine, and strong acid in the stomach. And from everything we knew, no bacteria would grow there. Well, guess what? In the last couple of months, literally within the last 2 months, we've just discovered that not only do we have bacteria in those areas that grow very beautifully, they're resistant to antibiotics. So you come back again and say, holy Toledo, what are we going to use to treat these organisms? It comes back to frequency again. We must have something that will kill these organisms because the antibiotics won't work. Well, the strep and staph and resistant TB, and strep causes rheumatic fever, and many of you will remember in the 1950s we had an epidemic of rheumatic fever. Some of you may have been affected during that time. I know a number of people that were. There was a large TB epidemic. Well, things are equal to what they were in the 50s again. And we have resistant organisms of both tuberculosis and of strep. In fact, it's gone so far now that the strep is actually eating flesh. They're so resistant to the antibiotics, and I mean, we can't get any stronger on the antibiotics. I mean, we're essentially giving chemotherapy now, very comparable to cancer chemotherapy on the antibiotic side. So what are you going to use? Well, believe it or not, these waters will work. The documentation that we have so far is in two of them, the electrolysis water and the deuterium water. That does not say that some of the others will not also do that. It's just that the studies have not been done yet to actually prove that. But in both the electrolysis water and the deuterium waters, there is evidence, there's academic proof that they will counteract even these bacterium that are resistant to antibiotics. So I can use water as opposed to some very strong antibiotics. I think I'd go that way as opposed to some very detrimental cell toxic material that will create other problems in the body. So you get a sense that maybe there is a little bit more to water than just something that I simply drink. Let's see if we can differentiate some of the different waters that we have here, and just bear with me a minute. And we'll go right down the pike if we can. Electrolysis, and if you remember the slide I showed you with the platinum and titanium, the chemical chart. We'll put that up for a minute here. As I said to you, between platinum and titanium, there's a whole slew of elements that are very unstable biochemically. And the common denominator for those elements is that when they're heated to a particular temperature, or other types of energy are introduced to them, those elements disappear. Now, I said to you that the brain, the fast-moving brain, has iridium and rhodium in it. In fact, the old cannibals that used to eat all kinds of brains, and some of you may like pig brains and beef brains, whatever, too, we find that they're loaded with iridium and rhodium, too, okay? But those fast-moving brains, we'll go back to dyslexia, we'll go back to the so-called attention deficit individuals, they're loaded with iridium and rhodium in those brains. So much they're processing very, very fast, from infancy all the way up to puberty. They're loaded with iridium and rhodium. Now, when the water passes over platinum and titanium plates, which are the plates that are in the electrolysis water systems, they convert the water into these middle elements, iridium and rhodium, okay? So what you're doing, because there's an alchemical process that takes place, and that would be extracted from the water. And so you're beginning to give back to the brain what it needs to operate at peak performance. So you're putting jet fuel in a jet engine. Get the idea of what's going on there and why platinum and titanium just happen to be picked as the two elements that the water passes over. Things are turned into a non-toxic format. So much so that, and so selectively that, I said to you it would wipe out any bacteria, the flesh-eating types of bacteria. Anything that produces a toxin cannot withstand the frequency generated in electrolysis when the plates are made of platinum and titanium. I don't care what it is. But if it's a good bacterium, I got strep in my mouth that allow me to make saliva so that I can break down some of my foodstuffs. I have lactobacillus in my digestive tract that will allow me to break down dairy products, okay? I don't want to wipe those out. Guess what? It won't wipe those out unless they begin to produce a toxin. It's that selective. So we're talking about an extraordinary frequency that's generated here. You know, that things are happening. It will convert lead to a non-toxic format. So if you have lead in your water system, if you have chlorine, if you have fluoride, whatever, they're converted to a non-toxic format. It also provides negatively charged ions to the liver. And thus, they are used and certified by the Minister of Health of Japan and the head of the Russian Academy of Sciences for use in cirrhosis of the liver. Now, remember we talked about there being electrolysis membranes throughout your body? Well, we start the process in the beginning. So that kidneys, heart, liver, brain, all are able to receive this very, very easily. You get the principle about what we're doing, okay? Now, the frequency that's generated there is on the lower spectrum. I tried to group some things as we get to higher and higher frequencies here. So at least for everyday kinds of drinking water, you could feel pretty safe in terms of drinking this, because it doesn't matter what's in your water system, whether it's a metal, whether it's a gas, whether it's an organism. It's going to be rendered helpless when it's introduced to these waters. In fact, slugs, if you begin to spray it on your plants, they don't die, they just run away. Parasites run out of your digestive tract. It will not kill them in the drinking water frequency. It will chase them out of your system. But things are changed to a non-toxic format. Let's move on to the clustered water. When I look at the clustered water, it's first small clusters again, so I can easily get into the cells. I've said to you that water is a magnet, so it's going to pull to it whatever it comes in contact with. Now, if I happen to put some good things next to it, those good things are going to go into the water. If you just sat a glass of water on a table and you put, well, what shall we put next to it? Okay, a bowl of fruit next to it. After a certain period of time, all the elements in that fruit will be in that water. If you have the equipment available to evaluate what's in that water, in not too long a period of time, fruit will be evident in that water. That's how magnetic water is. Whatever's next to it. It can become a battery in itself. You could put a battery here, and in short order, that water would become a battery. Whatever's next to it, okay, it's going to draw. That's why it becomes very important in what kind of container you put your water in. Ideally, for the kinds of containers that we have available, glass would be one of the slower leaching types of materials to put your water in, because it's going to take its time, and there are natural materials in the glass that if it leaches, at least that's what's going into the water. If you're going to use a plastic container, you want to use one that will slowly leach into the water. Again, be as close to glass as possible. So the thing to look for in the bottom of your containers is always this little triangle, and look for the number 7, because it means that is the closest to glass that you're going to get in terms of a container for water. And if you'll look at things like some of the milk cartons or whatever, they're like a number 1. And it's pretty easy for that plastic to get into your containers. And that bothers me a bit as we talk about distilled waters, in that most of the distilled water that you're going to get from your grocery shelf is a number 1 container, number 1. But secondly, it will have sat in the warehouse next to who knows what. We test the distilled waters when they've come in, and I've yet to see one above 5.5 for pH. So you're starting out backwards already with putting a very acid thing in your system that you're mixing things with. Now, it bothers me when I hear this thing about using steam distilled water. That's a joke, guys. All distilled water is steamed. In fact, one of the manufacturers changed their label of steam distilled because everybody was asking for it. They think it's a big joke. You know, all distilled water is steamed. In fact, it's the water that's collected at the top of the steam vessel. You know how the water boils and the steam comes off? Well, in the distiller, that water that comes up as steam is collected, and that's the water that comes out. Now, that's good, except for whatever else boils at 100 degrees will also come into that steam. So the things that don't boil at 100 won't come up there. They'll stay in the bottom of the container. But those that boil at 100 degrees will come with your steam water into your jug. which could be some of those trihalomethanes and a few other items that you don't want, vaporous kinds of things that were in the water to begin with. Now, what you hear people talking about is double distilled water. That's usually laboratory-grade distilled water. That's very expensive. And it is used in laboratory settings for most of their experiments, etc., in terms of, you know, their use where they must be precise. And that is very specially treated distilled water in that they're sure there's nothing in it. So please don't get confused there in terms of distilled water. Now, what Dr. Lorenzen has been able to do is, because everything that gets near water is picked up by water, if one could control, therefore, what the water is next to or introduced to, then I could put some good things in there too. And so what happens, we hear the word template. I would take something that's good, put it in the right quantity that I would like to have it emanate the right frequency, and put the water next to it. And now that's transferred into the water, because water has quite a memory. And it will remember what you put next to it. So if you start with a good distilled water, put next to it something good, then that will be absorbed into the water. And thus we enter the arena of homeopathics in terms of putting something next to that can be contained in water that will hold it. Now what he does is use a cold sterilization process and administer a very strong magnetic pulse to the water. And thus he has small clusters. So we've got that memory and we have that structure. Remember, that's important. And then we've added to it the right frequency of a particular element, a good element that you want in the water. And that's how that works. So when we talk about the water being in its clustered format, we are then translating to the water, who then translates to each one of those cells. It gives the message to each one of those cells what you want those cells to say. Now, what's the importance of that? Let's take a look at diabetes for just a minute. When I look at the pancreas, there's an enzyme made in the pancreas called trypsinogen. It's an enzyme. And in the small intestine, we have sort of the end point, or trypsin, is the final format that we want that particular enzyme that comes from the pancreas to be in, to be able to help digest our foodstuffs. Now, we couldn't account for that enzyme coming from trypsinogen to trypsin by simply saying, well, oh, just something happens in there, and I had trypsinogen, and now I got trypsin over here in the small intestine. Couldn't figure it out. Except through the equipment that we now have, we could measure, and we found out that trypsin was surrounded by 300 different receptors for water. In almost an onion format, they surround the trypsin enzyme. And there's a communication system, just like those ripples of water that go out when I drop something in the center of a silent pond and the rings go out. Well, by having a message transferred by a strong magnetic pulse to the pancreas that says, I need to make you into trypsin, that message is transferred ring by ring, water ring by water ring, to make it trypsin in the small intestine. Can you see what's happening there? He's actually making the water, because again it becomes a frozen crystal, very similar to the format of water at the bottom of glaciers. Now we know that the best water, the best structure for water that will carry information the best, is coming from the bottom of glaciers. And what he has managed to do is to come up with a way to replicate that structure as if they're coming from the bottom of glaciers. And people, the latest thing out is that people are selling chunks of water coming from the bottom of glaciers. That's the hottest thing going right now. some entrepreneur is now cutting chunks of water and is selling them for $25 a bag. So I'm sure someone will soon be up at Mount Rainier trying to get to the bottom of the glacier to cut the chunks out to sell. I mean, but it's that principle that we're working with. And I'm going through this because each one of these waters is made differently. We get to a similar endpoint because of the amount of energy, the amount of frequency that's translated in each one of these waters. So thus we're getting a healing effect. But again, remember, we're starting with the battery up here. So we're talking about electricity to begin with. If I can get the right electricity going to the brain, then that brain's going to begin putting out the right product. But I got to get the water to it first. So it has to be small enough to get there. Once it's there, will it translate down to the cells? See where we're going? And so we're moving up the scale here in terms of the way it goes. If I move to the next water for just a minute here, deuterium water, and what's the significance of it? In 1933, many of you were around to remember the development of, which is when the atom bomb, they began the development of it. Deuterium is an element in the production of the atomic bomb. Heavy water made from deuterium. Now, deuterium itself is just what we call an isotope of hydrogen. It's another form of hydrogen. There are 3 forms of hydrogen. You can look at it as just ordinary hydrogen. You can look at deuterium as a second type of hydrogen within the hydrogen molecule, and tritium, which is the third type of hydrogen within the hydrogen molecule. The problem with the third one there is that it's radioactive. Deuterium is not radioactive. It is in almost every element on the earth. You'll find deuterium. You will specifically find it, or especially find it, in seawater. It's loaded with deuterium. So that what happened, Dr. Story, in his guilt from being one of the individuals that was responsible for development of the atomic bomb, decided that I better do something for mankind that might be useful with deuterium. He probably had, not probably, he had more incentive too, because all the scientists that were involved with the development of the atomic bomb all wound up having radiation exposure. And so they were getting sick and they were dying. So they had to come up with something that would keep them alive, including, you know, he himself. And in the process of things, he developed deuterium from a healthy perspective. And what we find is deuterium comes in a couple different formats. It comes as deuterium oxide, which would be heavy water. And to be noted, D2O is the chemical formula for that. You only want a little bit of deuterium oxide in your body. Otherwise, that begins to tear the body apart. You do not want deuterium oxide. It will collect in the liver, it will collect in the fat cells, and begin to destroy the body. So please take note. You don't want heavy water in your body. What you would like perhaps to have would be deuterium sulfate, D2SO4. And in that format, as long as it is not in very, very heavy concentrations, we find that good things start happening in the body. And of particular note, tumors begin to dissolve. They begin to liquefy in a very short period. In fact, they're talking about a 30-day time frame for tumors to completely dissolve, whether they be cancerous tumors or not yet cancerous tumors. Deuterium has the other property of taking from water that's already in the body oxygen, but good oxygen. Now, we looked at oxidation. Remember, we looked at the rust and the body rusting. So we don't want the bad oxygen. We want to tie that up. Deuterium releases the appropriate type of negatively charged hydrogen to tie up the free radicals, number one. But it also releases what we call a nascent oxygen that can in fact give oxygen back to the cells. Now, in ancient times, the Earth's atmosphere was 30% oxygen. It's now 14% oxygen. That's our atmosphere. We're living in a time of oxygen deprivation. You go into coma when the oxygen drops down to 10%. So we're in trouble, okay? Now, deuterium sulfate in the body has the property of releasing the good oxygen from the body, so that, especially with individuals that are having difficulty with their lungs, they find that they're getting more oxygen in their cells, usable oxygen. So asthmatics, they're reporting that asthma is totally cured within a 2-month process. So you can see perhaps what's going on here. The thing to look for in deuterium waters is that they not be too heavy a concentration, that they be essentially homeopathic concentrations of deuterium sulfate. And some of you will remember shaking up the anabolic water, which is available on the market right now, and hydroxygen. You're shaking it just to stimulate the frequency of the homeopathic in the deuterium. It is a major player. You're going to hear a lot more about deuterium in the very short future. It's one of the better waters available, especially for cancer, especially for lung problems. And I'm going to group together here for diabetes also. All 3 of these waters that I've spoken of so far, the electrolysis water, the clustered water, and the deuterium water, are excellent for diabetes. We've talked about the clustered in terms of the communication network that's established by the way that's made. What we have found, again, this is all new research, in the diabetic, especially in infants with juvenile diabetes, they've isolated some viruses in their pancreas. Remember again, these organisms weren't supposed to be in that part of the digestive tract. They weren't supposed to be able to live. Well, they have found E. coli and viruses in that part of the digestive tract. And they suspect very strongly, again, they're resistant organisms, that is a cause for diabetes. All 3 of these waters will attack the pancreas, E. coli, and viruses. And thus we find that diabetics are responding very well to these waters. When we increase the frequency, it means things happen faster. So we start at one frequency, we go up higher and higher as I'm going down the scale here, so that things will happen with all of them. Some it will happen with faster than others. So it's like, welcome to a whole new world of water. And you can get a sense that there is something happening to the body with these waters. I'm going to mention for a minute the equator here and Dr. Werner Kropp, because I have to give him credit for a lot of the work in this arena. Dr. Kropp was a Swiss scientist who discovered all of this stuff around 1930. And he's the one that taught the Russians. And the Japanese visited him, and the Saudis and the Egyptians. He discovered zeta potential and started talking about zeta potential during that period of time. He went up for a Nobel Prize for several years, was turned down. But I've been to his place. As I say, these coinkydinks, I just happen to wind up in these places. And unfortunately, he was killed for his technology. One of the mafias offered $100 million for his technology. He turned him down. And within 2 weeks, he was dead. Now, I have actually seen, through the use of his particular little system that uses strong magnetic pulses in it. I don't know all the particulars about it because, again, it's a proprietary process. But I know that when we poured water that had cholera in it, We poured it through 3 times, and that water became drinkable in terms of the infectious organisms that were in it. I know that a larger version of it has been used in Chernobyl, and when water has been poured through it, it was converted to IV solution. It was that sterile. So I know these things exist, and I must give credit to him for the initial pioneering work that he did. There are 4 scientists that so far have been taken away from us because of their work in these waters on an international basis. A word about crystal energy, which works basically on the same principle that the clustered water works. The question that we have with the crystal energy at this point, and only Dr. Flanagan can answer the question for us. Remember I talked about that very sophisticated piece of equipment that is one of a kind in the world, and we can actually look at things at the colloidal level and see what's in them, whatever. We're noticing that there is a soap made from a potassium base in that particular element, and it is used to make the water cluster. The problem we have that when we add that type of soap to water, it means that the viscosity drops. When the viscosity drops, the pH drops, and that element becomes toxic. But again, you wouldn't see it through all the normal chemical analysis, through all the normal physics analysis. It looks good. We see clustering. We see effects on the body. It's the long-term effects that we have problems with. When we start talking about colloids, and again, now you know what a colloid is, and the importance of colloids in terms of being able to get into the cell. Very few things are true colloids, even though they're reported to be. In fact, we only found one that was truly colloidal when we examined it, even though on the label they were all said to be colloidal minerals. So that you want to keep that in mind. Silica that is not colloidal can be destructive to the cell. When it is combined with one of these bioavailable waters, it will pull things into the cell 10 times faster than anything else you could add to it. So it's fine if we're pulling good stuff in. It's not so good if we're pulling bad stuff in. At the end of the Sufi water, they tell us environmentally works extremely good on cleaning up the environment. We're seeing that the petrochemical made elements, which means everything from oil and everything made from oil, are being converted and broken down to their most elemental parts, meaning you're finding the protein, you're finding the amino acids in them. And it is reported that it has cleaned up entire lakes with just using a small amount to just clean up an entire lake. It's a new kid on the block. Remember what I said in terms of the academic studies. Don't look for the academic studies. They're not there yet. You should see in short order from the intent of the individuals that have produced this water and that they're about being harmless, that this water will probably wind up being at least as good as all the other waters that we've talked about. At this moment, most of the experimentation has been done with environmental elements like, cleaning up rivers and streams and environments. Again, you're nothing but a small representation of the bigger, so it should clean you up the same way. And the reports, at least testimonially so far, have been in the arena of it does detox. And digestive systems are cleaning up, so we are pulling stuff out of the system. I cannot say more on that yet because I haven't had a chance to really talk at length to the scientists working with it, nor the spiritualists working with it. But I expect something very good to come forth from that. I've tried to present to you some of the best waters in the world as far as their interface with human bodies. They do have the same effect on animals. They will have the same effect on plants. Remember the equation of life that I showed you. It all operates under the same principle.